In this video, I take a look at AMS2 in 2025 and try to push the graphical settings for the Quest 3 as far as I can using a 4070 Super, and also take a look at the general state of AMS2 after the latest round of updates. And all this from an older gamer's perspective. A little under a year ago, I did a deeper dive into the graphical settings I recommend for VR using the Quest 3 and a 4070 Super. But since then, AMS2 has had a number of updates, and also Nvidia have released lots of new drivers for the 4070 Super. And on top of that, the Meta app has had some changes as well. Given all that, it's probably time to look again at the recommended graphical settings for AMS2 when using the Quest 3. In the following sections, I will cover the settings I use for Quest 3 and AMS2. I will look at some settings you might want to consider tweaking if your system is struggling to maintain a decent FPS in VR, and also look at how to implement OpenXR into AMS2 when running it from your Steam library. And I will take a broad look at what AMS2 is offering these days in this very competitive sim racing market. Check the time codes if you want to skip along to the section that interests you the most.
Skip down here, blah, blah, blah.
Recommended graphical settings for VR. In the video I made last year, I gave a detailed overview of which AMS2 settings affect FPS the most when using VR, specifically with the Quest 3 and the 4070 Super. The difference to performance headroom that each of these settings has in AMS2 when used with VR hasn't changed, so I won't bore you by explaining all of that again, but if you're interested, I will link the video below and you can take a look. Instead, I'm going to give a brief overview of my current settings. Brief because comments of my previous videos have asked that I show my recommended settings up front with less explanation. Let me know below if you prefer this new way of my presenting settings for VR. All that being said, my recommendation for graphical settings in AMS2 are now slanted higher to give a better graphical fidelity in VR, but using some adjusted settings in the Meta app and the Oculus debug tool to keep the performance headroom at sensible levels. So first of all, I have the Meta app set to run the Quest 3 at 90 Hz with the slider at 1.3x, 2 clicks down from the maximum of 1.5x. You can pump this higher if your GPU will allow it. The Oculus debug tool is set with the FOV tangent multiplier at 0.8 for the vertical and 0.7 for the horizontal. Don't forget, you may need to set this again for every VR session. ASW is disabled, something else you might need to reset for every VR session, and the video codec is set to H.264 and the encode bitrate to 500. Sharpening is set to normal. If you are new to VR and none of what I just said makes any sense whatsoever, take a look at this video for getting started with a Quest headset when linking to a PC, and also this video which takes a deeper dive into the Oculus debug tool. Moving back to the settings of AMS2, the performance and visual tabs look like this for me. Pause now if you want to take a note of these choices. And the VR tab, which doesn't really contain very much, looks like this, which I think is pretty much the defaults anyway. These settings, Meta app, Oculus debug tool, and AMS2 tabs push the Quest 3 a lot harder than my previous video from a year ago, which means that even though AMS2 has been improved in various ways, VR performance has not been tanked by this process, which is more than one can say for iRacing, which has become harder and harder to run on the same hardware over the same period of time. That rant aside, these settings, when used in AI races, which is my main use for AMS2, gives me a consistent 90 FPS with just the occasional dip into 89 FPS, which is fairly typical for most sims running with the Quest 3. And of course, like most sims, I see most of that performance drop on a heavily crowded grid, but this usually clears up as the field spreads out during the course of a race. Despite these more aggressive settings, the performance headroom is, well, it's okay. I mean, there isn't a lot of headroom spare. That's clear from this graph. You can see that. But the performance, the frames per second, doesn't seem to suffer. The frame rate at 90 Hz is constantly stable at 90 FPS. Here I am after selecting a preset for a GT4 race at Brands Hatch, which gives me by default 30 cars on the grid. At the start of the race, the performance headroom is low but sustainable and still able to give me the required 90 FPS that I want. And it has to be said, with some terrific graphics. The cars look fantastic here, don't they? Moving round the track as the race spreads out, the performance headroom starts to look better. This tends to be the case in the various preset races I've tried. Here I'm at the open-topped Formula V with the default number of cars set at 20 for this class, and the performance headroom looks pretty good, even with the added smoke kicked out by these fun little cars. And lastly, this is the G40 preset race at the Nordschleife with 23 cars on the grid of my all-time favourite track. And again, the frame rate is stable and consistent, even if there isn't a lot of performance headroom left in the pot. But do I need any more performance headroom? Do I? All of these races were run at the maximum number of cars for that particular preset template for that class of car, and none of them showed any dramatic frame drops whatsoever. They were all showing terrific graphics and all offering a highly enjoyable single player experience. They look beautiful. They really do. Look at it. The fact that I can push the graphics of AMS2 this far in VR in a variety of different cars on different tracks is amazing. The tracks look detailed, plenty of background objects around there to keep everybody happy, and even the occasional drone flying by if you spot them. They're fun. And I still have, with all of this going on, a stable 90 FPS, which makes me a very happy sim driver. However, you just knew I was going to say that, didn't you? These settings are not going to be great if the weather is set to heavy rain or even full-on storm. Here you can see the FPS shows drops to a point that will ruin your VR experience in both of those examples. In the next section, I will give you some ideas on stuff you can do about these problems, or if you're simply struggling in clear weather to maintain a decent frames per second because your system just doesn't have the grunt.
Scotty, we need power.
Clawing back performance headroom. If, when using these settings I now recommend for AMS2 in 2025, you find your system drops frames either in bad weather or in a race with a lot of cars, or simply because your PC isn't powerful enough for these settings in VR, there are still some things you can do about this. Firstly, you can optimize your PC. Yes, I've detailed a clear way to achieve that in this video, which is, I know, about iRacing, but the earlier sections are relevant to all sim users. I'll post a link below. Take a look and do your PC a big favor, get it optimized and benchmark it. Assuming you have optimized your PC and you are still having issues, then the easiest solution to VR FPS woes would be to change the meta app from 90 Hz to 72 Hz. Here you can see the performance headroom for 72 Hz on the left and 90 Hz on the right. I generally don't use 80 Hz as I can find it to be a bit flaky. 72 Hz clearly gives more performance headroom, which can help out in extreme racing scenarios such as poor weather or on PCs that are not as powerful as one would prefer. If you are looking for more performance headroom without lowering the graphical setting in AMS2, 72 Hz in the Meta app is the way to go. And it has to be said, moving to 72 Hz is a quick and painless solution. It just needs one reboot of the Meta app to take effect. And you can also alter the slider here if you want in the Meta app if you need even more performance. I find 1.3x offers good graphical fidelity while places less demand on the GPU than say 1.5x. But if you need more, lowering the slider to 1.2x could help. However, you might prefer to use 90 Hz at 1.3x or even 1.5x for whatever reason. So what else can you do to claw back performance headroom? Another easy fix is to drop the encode bitrate in the Oculus debug tool down by 100 each time and see which value helps you attain a decent and consistent FPS. I've often run at 450 or even 350 and it doesn't lower the overall visual quality that much in AMS2. 500 is better. Higher than that is even better. But if your system can't take it, lower it down a little bit. see what happens. If you would prefer not to do that, then another solution could be to increase the FOV tangent multiplier in the Oculus debug tool. How much you increase this will depend on your threshold for getting distracted by the black bars this setting produces. These are the black bars at 0.8 by 0.7, my usual setting, and seen like this, it does look to be very distracting. But these black bars appear in my peripheral vision, both to the sides and the top and bottom, so I very rarely notice them. As an example here, on the left, this is 90 Hz with 0.7 for the vertical setting. In the middle is 0.6 for the vertical. And on the far right, 0.5 for the vertical. As you can see, there is significant gains to be had by just adjusting the vertical setting and leaving the horizontal at 0.8. However, if you change the vertical to 0.6 or even 0.5, then you are likely to notice these black bars while racing, and they can be distracting. 0.5 in particular is extreme and not everyone's cup of tea. In fact, those that use this setting equate the visual aspect seen here as akin to driving while wearing a racing helmet. I'm not sure about that theory, as I can remember racing karts and driving a motorbike for years wearing a helmet, and I can't say I remember seeing the world quite like this, but each to their own. Point remains that if you need extra performance headroom, this will give it to you. And if you combine a radical FOV tangent multiplier with 72 Hz, you can obtain an even greater performance headroom. If you don't want to do any of these alterations to the Meta app or the Oculus debug tool or the tangent multiplier or whatever, you are going to need then to drop some settings inside AMS2. The bad ones are always MSAA, track detail, and of course shadows. In the lesser evil category are anisotropic filtering, environment maps, and any setting that has anything to do with mirrors. Turning down any or all of these will give you more performance headroom at the expense of degraded graphical quality. Finding which setting works best for your VR headset and your eyes or your system is always a case of trial and error, but stick with it, as the process can be completed much quicker than you think. And the overall experience after you hit that sweet spot is definitely worth the effort.
We found our sweet spot.
Using OpenXR with AMS2 in Steam. Another way to gain performance, albeit a little fiddlier and requiring some DLL downloads, is to use the OpenXR codec to run AMS2 in Steam. iRacing has this option on the load menu, but for AMS2 in Steam, you have to fool the loader into using a DLL that will allow OpenXR to be used with AMS2. Fortunately, this is pretty easy to accomplish, and I've covered where to find the assets you need and what to do with them in this video here. Follow the simple instructions and away you should go. Once the OpenXR codec is available for AMS to use, you will see a performance gain. How big a gain will depend on the settings you use in AMS2 and the GPU in your system. However, bear in mind that if you also twin this with the settings I recommended earlier in the Oculus debug tool, then you will probably see even bigger gains. And there are some additional gains to be had using the OpenXR toolkit, which I've also covered in this video. That being said, even without the OpenXR toolkit, you can still use the OpenXR codec. And here you can see AMS2 running with ultra settings on most of everything that can be ultra and still achieving a decent amount of headroom. So overall, in my opinion, it's OpenXR for the win in AMS2.
It's what I like to call a win-win-win.
Conclusions. The road to version 1.6 for AMS2 has taken a fair amount of time to journey along towards. In fact, I did wonder if we were ever going to get there, but now that 1.6 has been released and nicely patched up to deal with some of the issues that version 1.6 introduced, it's nice to see that VR performance hasn't suffered in the process. And I'm happy that using a combination of the Meta app and the FOV multiplier in the Oculus debug tool and also the OpenXR codec has allowed me to push the graphical settings of this fantastic sim racer a lot further than I used to be able to. In all, right now, in my opinion, AMS2 is one of the best looking sims on the market, certainly coming close, although not exceeding LMU in graphical quality and sheer playability, which is remarkable considering how old the engine is that AMS2 is based on. Right now, in 2025, you can race AMS2 in VR with some great looking graphics and handling that has also been greatly improved. I recently jumped into Project Cars 2, which is what AMS2 is based on, and became very much aware of how much work has been put into improving the force feedback in AMS2. It is much better than Project Cars 2, and it is pretty good in its own right. In fact, I think AMS2 offers some of the best road holding outside of Assetto Corsa 1, with some cars like the V seen here being a real joy to throw around the track, controlling slides and pushing the car to its absolute limit of grip. Going onto the grass is still a little bit of an ice rink, but otherwise the grip on track offered now in AMS2 is outstanding, and if you have a direct drive wheel, you will have a lot of fun with this simulator. All in all, for the money and the content you get, along with this new handy preset button you can use to create any style of race you fancy quickly and without fuss, AMS2 probably represents one of the best single player experiences on the market, second only to the modded version of AC1. If they ever get around to adding career mode, tantalizingly close it would seem from this grayed out and non-functional tile in the main menu, then AMS2 will be my go-to single player racing sim. No question at all. Career mode really is the last piece of the puzzle for me, and I hope they include it soon. If you haven't tried AMS2 and you see it up for sale, snatch it. Try these settings, add OpenXR, and you won't regret the purchase. Let me know in the comments if you've tried these settings and if they worked for you, or if you have even better ones to recommend to me. In the meantime, I hope you found this video helpful, and until the next one, race clean, and I'll see you on track. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click the little bell icon if you want to be notified of any future videos.